If reproduction and development in herbivorous insects are as adversely affected by the levels of host plant nitrogen as most of the data suggests, then we might expect various adaptations to evolve that allow herbivores to buffer themselves against low nitrogen levels. What we'll talk about today are some of these adaptations. And I've just listed them here. And we'll go through them. Today we'll talk about some of these adaptations, which include compensatory feeding or variable feeding rates, the selection of high nitrogen sites on a host plant, tracking optimal resources in space and time, either through migration or diapause. We already talked about this a little bit. The modification or manipulation of a host plant by an herbivore to increase the available nitrogen. This is kind of hijacking the plant itself. Or obtaining nitrogen from non-host plant resources, even if you are an herbivore. Let's start with the first one, compensatory feeding. So what is compensatory feeding? Well, the short of it is just eat more food. And, so what is compensatory feeding? And the short of it is you just eat more food. If the food is low in nitrogen, you just take in a lot more of it. Now, as we talked about in the ecological stoichiometry section, there are some risks of doing this. One is that you may be exposed to toxins in the plants, in your food, that come along with the ride if you're trying to get a lot of nitrogen. And the flip side is that you might be getting excess nitrogen. And the flip side is that you will get an excess source of carbon that you have to get rid of as you are trying to get that nitrogen. So nitrogen occurs in very dilute concentration in plants. And so eating more tissue, either by increasing the rate or increasing the amount of time feeding on that plant, is one way to actually do this. These are examples of insects that have higher feeding rates in an attempt to get more nitrogen. Aphids, a lot of sap-feeding insects that are tapped into the phloem. And remember, the phloem is even lower in percent nitrogen than leaf tissue is. So if you're a leaf-chewing insect, you have a different set of challenges compared to phloem-feeding insects. One thing you can do is process a lot of plant juice and to capture that nitrogen. So these are spittlebugs, and spittlebugs have this name because they're sucking in a lot of phloem, and spittlebugs have this name because in the process of trying to get at that scarce nitrogen, they're pumping through a lot of that carbohydrates, a lot of that sugary solution out of their body, along with water and along with other things. Aphids do this really well. They actually secrete a substance called honeydew. This honeydew is rich in sugar, and you can actually, this sugary stuff, sometimes there's so many aphids that the sugary stuff actually will fall out of the trees and blanket the ground, or your car if you're parked underneath it. And various other organisms actually have learned to take advantage of this. Ants in particular that love sugar, that need carbon, will actually tend aphids and harvest this secretion that comes from that comes out of their guts, basically out of the hindgut. So as I mentioned, phloem and xylem contain excess carbon relative to nitrogen and amino acids. So particularly for phloem, increasing ingestion means you have to get rid of a lot of excess carbon. Insects that are adapted to feeding on phloem and xylem have what is referred to as a filter chamber. That is, the front part of the midgut forms a thin-walled bladder that actually wraps around the hindgut. the posterior part of the hindgut and part of the Malpighian tubules. The Malpighian tubules are these tendril-like things that come out of the at the junction of the hindgut and the midgut that are basically like the kidneys of insects. They serve as a water transport mechanism. And what you can get is a selective secretion of, and what you can get is the selective retention of amino acids and the elimination of excess nutrients. And what you can get is the selective retention of amino nitrogen and the elimination of excess sugars because of this filter chamber. And basically what happens is that the insect cells in this area secrete potassium and chloride, salts basically, into this area in the posterior midgut and create an osmotic potential that basically pulls water out of the hemolymph and back into the hindgut, and that's how it gets excreted. So imagine making a really briny solution, a really salt briny solution that's going to try to balance out osmotically, and the way it does that is by pulling water out of the tissues after it had been absorbed into the body. So that's what the filter chamber actually is. So a lot of phloem and xylem feeding insects do this. So getting rid of water is a problem with xylem insects because these are the ones feeding on the water that comes up. Getting rid of sugar is for the phloem insects that are feeding on the photosynthate-rich plant juices coming back from the leaves. Increasing the feeding rate is another way to get at that nitrogen that may be in low concentrations. This is an experiment that was done where they actually looked at the developmental rate. This is an experiment that they did looking at leaf consumption rate, how much plant material was eaten in a certain amount of time for different stages of these monarch caterpillars when they were fed on either low nitrogen plants compared to high nitrogen milkweeds. And what you can see here is that, in all cases, through all developmental stages, the lower the nitrogen content of the milkweeds, the more they actually fed in order to make up that difference. So this is another way to get at low nitrogen is to feed for a really long time. Things like periodical cicadas that feed as nymphs on the roots of plants. The roots where the xylem is coming in is very poor in nitrogen, and their developmental times can be on the magnitude of decades almost. And most of the cicadas species that we have actually are xylem feeders and generally have life cycles that are beyond a year. It just takes that long to get at that nitrogen pool. Here's some other examples of Here's some other examples of xylem feeders, including here's some other examples of xylem feeders, including spittlebugs, cercopids, and cicadas. Another way to buttress against low nitrogen is to go to places in the plant where the nitrogen is the highest. Nitrogen is not distributed evenly throughout a plant. Here is an example of plant hoppers, again, feeding on plants that either have, here's an example with plant hoppers again, feeding on plant parts that have variability in their plant nitrogen. And here you can see that the number of plant hoppers tends to be highest in areas where the plant nitrogen is the highest, which in this case was the flowering parts of the plant. Plants have different nitrogen dynamics in them depending on the time of season, the plant part, and so on. Typically, very rapidly growing plant parts are areas where nitrogen needs to be moved in order for growth of the plant tissues to actually happen. And as a consequence, these are places in the plants where aphids tend to aggregate. So aphid, the oleander aphid, Aphis nerei, and also feeds on all kinds of other things, including milkweeds, moves from the leaves during the early part of the season where leaves are rapidly growing into the seed pods or onto the seed pods where the seed pods are developing, and eventually onto senescing leaves as nitrogen is broken down from proteins and moved into more mobile forms so that it can be translocated into overwintering parts. So insects like aphids that have legs and are mobile are able to track this within a plant over the course of a season. Less mobile insects like scale insects are actually much more sensitive to variability in host plant nitrogen because they can't actually go and select the plant material out there. Another example of tracking, selecting plant, another example of finding places where, another example of selecting plants that have higher concentrations of nitrogen is to actually seek them out in space and time. I gave you the previous example was within a plant and moving to tissues within a plant that had higher nitrogen over the course of a season. The same can actually be seen over the course, the same can actually be seen across time over, the same can actually be seen across a lot of different plant species. Early on in the season, plants tend to have high water and high nitrogen, and as the plants senesce here, and as plants age and eventually senesce here, they tend to get tougher, drier, and lower nitrogen. This was seen for oak trees, for black cherry trees, for corn, for alfalfa, for cabbage. There tends to be this negative trend here between in water and in nitrogen concentration. Because of this, insects have gotten very good at actually finding plants within the environment that are easiest to access and have the highest and have the highest nitrogen concentration. So here's insects that emerge early on to take advantage of high protein content, high nitrogen content ferns here before leaves get tough, and tannins are like a toughening compound, carbon-containing compound, and before nitrogen concentrations get lower. So insects will actually track and use these plants early on before moving to other plants later on in the season. I already gave the example of sycamore aphids. I'm not going to repeat it here. You also have examples of host alternation by some insects that actually will feed on completely different plants depending on the season, like the bird cherry oat aphid. Bird cherry oat actually refers to the host alternation of this particular aphid, very common aphid, the Rhopalocyphum padai, where it feeds on trees early in the spring, presumably again because this is where the most of the nitrogen is, and then they switch to oat plants, so grasses, a completely different order of plants here in the summer before switching back to prunus, bird cherry oat, in the fall. So this is an example of resource tracking over space and over time. Here's a really cool way that insects can mobilize nitrogen within a plant by modifying it themselves. Aggregation of insects onto plant parts like this and pulling away carbon, because they're phloem feeders, they're getting a lot of carbon, tricks the plant into thinking that that there's an imbalance in the carbon to nitrogen ratio in the phloem tissue. And what plants do in response to this damage is actually move more nitrogen into these areas. This is referred to as a carbon or a nutrient sink, where plants mobilize resources to account for these imbalances within their own tissues. And it's actually the insects that have created these imbalances. So they can kind of keep the keep the nutrients coming by actually feeding on these plant tissues. Insects have gotten really good at insects have gotten really good. Oops. Insects have actually gotten really good at co-opting plant physiology to their own ends. Here you can see a series of diverse structures that are frequently referred to as galls, where inside of this there is a tiny little insect, and the plant has been hijacked basically to have, and the plant has basically been hijacked in order to create these structures that are rapidly growing. And remember, rapidly growing usually means more carbon and more nitrogen coming to them, and sometimes even double as a shelter for insects. And the way they do this is still a bit of a mystery, but is now getting better and better understood. But it's basically using some plant signaling compounds generated by the insects themselves to convince the plant to generate these abnormal structures right here. Here's a gall here. Sometimes these are bizarrely shaped. Sometimes they look like here's a classic oak gall here, which actually gets leathery and hard on the outside, and yet on the inside there are some insects that are feeding on the juicy tissues in here. So sometimes when you see these funny structures growing on the side of a leaf or on the side of a stem, these often have insects, or mites are also really good at creating these structures that they can take advantage of. And finally, herbivorous insects also can obtain nitrogen from other sources that are not plants. The most common way to do this is to actually cannibalize other insects. So maybe there's some flexibility in whether insects are entirely herbivorous if they are plant feeding. So why feed on resources that are 1 to 2% nitrogen, where by feeding on maybe your siblings or other herbivores here, you can get 12% or 10% nitrogen right away. So cannibalism, especially with young stages, is very common in many insects, both predators and herbivores. Sometimes there is opportunistic carnivory or omnivory. So for an herbivore, they can mix their diets by feeding on other non-plant material like other insects. Species like Lygus are notorious, are species like these plant bugs, Lygus hesperus, are famous for doing this. And in fact, sometimes they act as biological control agents. Penatomids do this a lot, where they'll feed sometimes on plants and sometimes on other insects. There actually are other groups of insects that have gone completely carnivorous. So in an evolutionary context here, these caterpillars, where most of the other species in these groups are entirely herbivorous, these caterpillars actually have become predatory in their life cycle. And it's thought that one of the driving forces of this might be this ability to get a higher nitrogen, to meet the higher nitrogen needs very quickly. Another way to get at nitrogen is to recycle, either by feeding on exuvie or the chorion, that is the cast outer shell of an egg. So you'll often see this behavior where caterpillars will feed on the shell of the egg, which may still have a little bit of nitrogen on there. Coprophagy, that is the feeding on an other animal's waste, is also seen in some insects. Butterflies do this a lot, where they will put their proboscis into splatters of bird feces or other animal feces, and that's because some of these excreta actually are very rich in salts or in other nutrients that might be absent in the host plants of these insects. you often see these aggregations of butterflies, sometimes near stream banks where the water has kind of dropped back a little bit, and there's these crusted little pools of concentrated ions that you'll see these butterflies actually a behavior that's called puddling. There are many other examples that I'm not going to have a chance to go into. Some insects have relationships with endosymbionts, where microbes obligate. Some insects have obligate relationships with microbes, endosymbionts that live in their guts, that allow them to actually get access to particular nutrients that they otherwise wouldn't have access to, and all kinds of other really interesting behaviors. But for the most part, if insects encounter resources that are low in nitrogen, they often have ways of trying to compensate for that.